So let's take a look at an example, and we'll take note of how the variables are declared, how the expression and scriptlet elements are combined within the JSP along with embedded HTML. And we'll also look to see how the include and param action elements are used. So here we have an internet application, two servlets, a controller and a model, but no view servlet. That's because we're using Java server pages for our views. So let's take a look in the controller to see how that changes things. This is dispatching the request to the model, validate input. And we're using the servlet exception mechanism for dealing with any errors. So we're assuming that everything is going to be absolutely fine, all the input is valid, and therefore having included that particular servlet, remember that's the URL of the servlet, we will then immediately dispatch the request when it comes back to the controller to the view. Now, because this is a Java server page, the URL for that is the actual file name for the JSP file. And we, having set up the request dispatcher in this way, we would then do the include as usual. And you can see that the request and response objects will be passed to that Java server page as usual. That, of course, is no surprise to us because the Java server page will have been converted to a servlet, and therefore we are just essentially including a servlet. Of course, if there is a problem in the validate input, that's going to throw an exception. So we've got all of that normal processing inside the try block, and then if there's a problem, we catch the servlet exception and we deal with it. In this example, what we're doing is creating an attribute on the request called exception, just like we did in previous examples. And then we are going to include the view error report Java server page. So let's take a quick look at the model to see what it's doing. This is going to, and when you run this in your own time to see how it works, you'll see the effect of this. But what's happening is that we're getting from the request parameter the number of tables that we want, because this application is going to output a table of multiplication tables. And the point here is that this value that has been input and stored as a string represents an integer. Therefore, we're going to attempt to parse it. Because it might not parse, because the string might not represent an integer, we might get a number format exception. So we put all of this in a try block and catch the number format exception. And if that happens, then we throw a new servlet exception with this error message. But if this does convert happily to an integer, then that gets stored in the variable num tables, and then we validate to make sure that it is in the range 1 to 20 inclusive. If it is out of that range, then we'll throw another exception, which of course will terminate execution of this try block. And if this condition is false, we'll just jump straight through here to set the attribute called number of tables on the request scope, passing that value. If there's been no error, then the view times tables is invoked. So let's take a look at it. Here's the Java server page. We've got the standard first line, and then we're including the contents of the header.html file, which is just a file in our web pages section of the project. So header.html is just some standard HTML that we want to use essentially as the header for every single output that could come. Now in this particular example, we've only got one type of output or one normal view. But if you've got a very large application, you'll want a consistent look and feel between all of the outputs. And therefore, what we can do is to use these static files, such as the header file, and we'll see in a moment the footer file, that will do all the standard header stuff and maybe do some structuring of the page and so on. And if we include that in every single Java server page, then we're going to get a consistent look and feel. Of course, we can also use in here, as we've got there, a style sheet. We can set up the style sheet, so it's using exactly the same style sheet for every single Java server page that is sent back to the web browser. So having included the header file, we then get some embedded HTML, just some standard stuff that is making reference here to an element in the cascading style sheet that was included as part of the header HTML. And then we've got a scriptlet. Now this scriptlet starts off by declaring a variable called numTables and making it equal to the attribute called number of tables and convert it to an integer. We're also declaring a variable called lower limit, and we're setting upper limit to be numTables plus the lower limit. Then we've got a for loop. Now this will need a little bit of explanation, because what we want here is to embed some HTML within the for loop. So as part of the scriptlet, we have the for loop declaration and the open brace for the for loop body. Then we have to terminate the scriptlet, because now we want to embed some HTML. So in this loop body, we've got an HTML tag for the table header. Then we've got an expression for the JSP, which will output the current value of col. And then we've got the end table header. So what we're going to get essentially is a whole load of table headers, in this case, starting at 1, finishing at 12, that goes across in the first row of the table. That being the end of the embedded HTML, what we can do now is start the scriptlet again for the close brace of the loop body and end the scriptlet, because now we want to embed another HTML tag. So by the time that first bit is executed, what we've got is a table with one row, and within that row we've got 12 headers labeled 1 to 12. Then we can get into processing the data, displaying the data. Now, here this is all going to be generated, but of course it might be that what you've done is get an array list of beans. And so now what you want to do is to iterate through the array list and output the contents of those beans. The concept would be exactly the same, but of course the Java code itself will be slightly different. But if you've done it in a servlet, then of course you can do it in a Java server page. So we have another for loop. This time, the value of the loop counter, row, is going to start at lower limit and will go up to, but not include, upper limit. So if number of tables had the value 20, then upper limit has got the value 21, and therefore row will start at 1 and go up to 20, but not include 21. And we're going to increment row by 1 each time we iterate. That's the end of the scriptlet. So we're going to embed now this Java server page action. So the JSP action is an include, which means that this page will now be invoked. It will execute. It will have the request and response objects passed to it automatically. But what we want to do is to add into that request the attribute called TableNum, whose value is equal to the current value of row. When row first is initialized, it will have the value 1. So on the first iteration, the value of TableNum will be 1. On the second iteration, the value of TableNum will be 2, and so on. When that page is invoked, there will be a new request scope attribute called TableNum added to it. Let's have a look at what happens. In display row, the first thing it does is to get from the request the parameter called TableNum, which was what was set up here. Then it will parse it as an integer and store its value in the variable TableNum. Then, and you'll see this when it runs, the table is going to alternate row color. And the way that we do that is by having an expression here, a JSP expression that will test the value of TableNum to see if the remainder, when divided by 2, equals 0. In other words, to see if the value of TableNum is even. If it is even, then we're not going to output anything at this point. If it's odd, we're going to say that the class equals alternate background. You will see the effect of that when you execute this. So that angle bracket there terminates the expression. This angle bracket terminates the table row HTML tag. Then we've got a table header in which we have got the value of TableNum. Then we're going to iterate 12 times and output for each one of these a table data cell, which will have the value I times TableNum. So it's going to output the Let's say table number's got the value 1, it's going to output 1, 2, 3, 4 up to 12. If the table number's got the value 5, it'll output 5, 10, 15, 20, blah, 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 up to 60, and so on. So each time this JSP file is invoked, it will output one table row, an HTML table, containing the multiplication table for the nominated table num. And that will be called this number of times, however many upper limit happens to be. And then we've got the embedded HTML end table tag. And finally, down at the bottom here, we have another page directive, this time to do with the static inclusion for the footer.html file, which in this example is very simple, but of course could include all kinds of other things like copyright notices and so on. And maybe even something in there that would say when this page was last updated. Well, of course, if you're going to do that, well, this page has just been dynamically generated. The static bit that we're now seeing would no longer be appropriate if you wanted to put in the current date and time, because that's something that is dynamically generated, and therefore you can't use a footer.html file because that's static. What you would have to do instead is to convert this to a Java server page, and then instead of doing a static inclusion, you would have to do a JSP include down here for footer.jsp. So there we have an example then of removing the view servlet and replacing it with a view Java server page. And there were probably two view servlets, one for normal view and one for error view. And therefore we've got two view Java server pages, one for error and one for normal processing. If we take a quick look in here, we can see that this too has the static inclusion for the header and for the footer. And what we're doing within that is to get the exception attribute from the request scope, convert it to an exception object, store it in E, and then we can call e.getMessage as part of this expression element of JSP. The effect of that then is to have the standard header, then the error message that's come from the model. So it'll be, for example, user input error, the number of tables is not in the range 1 to 20, or user input error, num tables is not an integer. Whichever one of those it is, that message will then be reported here. And then there's the file footer. And that's as far as this example goes. The tutorial, of course, will give you experience in dealing with these kinds of things in Java server pages.